Good morning. I'm Ada Palmer. I'm in the history department here at U Chicago. I'll be moderating this morning's panel. I will say a few words and then introduce each speaker, and then each speaker will speak for 10 minutes or less, and then we'll have a discussion. But to begin, just to set the tone for our treatment of the history of liberal arts education. The acclaimed Welsh novelist Jo Walton wrote in her award-winning fictionalized memoir of her own literary self-education growing up in impoverished Wales, of a real moment in 1979 when she read Roger Zelazny's science fiction novel Doorways into Sand. And in it was described a fantastical utopian educational system in which you would go to college for 4 years or sometimes even longer, and in which you could take science courses and classics and read Plato and also study physics. And she, as a young person in the UK system who was already at the age of 14 facing the hard choice of giving up the sciences in order to pursue literature, thought this was science fiction. Genuinely believed that this, like the flying cars and the moon bases, was a fantastical invention of a utopian fiction author. And it took her another 6 years to discover that in fact this was a real system that existed on another continent far away and provided this amazing thing, liberal education. I bring up this example because we are discussing a very powerful and particular and from our perspectives right now, fragile creation of the modern intellectual world, but one that, as we're going to explore this morning, has very deep roots. Yesterday's discussions reminded me of a speech which Ursula K. Le Guin gave 2 years ago when she received the Lifetime Achievement Award at the National Book Awards, in which she was worried about a parallel process to that which is threatening current liberal education, that is of the threat of the commercialization of the production of literature, and how increasingly sales departments are taking over from editorial departments and encouraging authors to write for the market, write works which are saleable instead of writing the works that people as artists want to produce. A very parallel experience to liberal arts. She said in that speech, I quote, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. And resistance often begins in art, and especially in our art, the art of words," end quote. Liberal arts education, as she reminds us here, like literature, has survived through multiple epochs of human history longer than the capitalist world whose threat looms so large around us. And I hope that one of the achievements of this morning's panel will be a reminder that as frightening as many of the forces we face may be, all things can be changed by human beings, and this educational system has endured longer and larger changes than the ones we are watching now. Our first speaker, Carlos Fraenkel, is James McGill Professor in the Departments of Philosophy and Jewish Studies at McGill University. He is a philosopher whose research and teaching spans ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, mainly Jewish and Islamic, and early modern philosophy, mainly Spinoza. He also has an interest in political philosophy, in particular in questions related to cultural difference, identity, and autonomy. And most recently, he has published Teaching Plato in Palestine, Philosophy in a Divided World.
Yeah, thank you, Ada, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Aviva and Aaron, for the invitation. I must apologize because what I'm going to present here is a very rough and inchoate outline of a new project, and much of what I'm going to say is very compressed and vague, but I hope not fundamentally misleading. Anyway, so Philosophia Vitae Magistra. Philosophy is a teacher or the guide of life. This is a claim Cicero makes in the Tusculan Disputations that I came across in a somewhat exotic setting a few years ago when I spent part of a sabbatical in Salvador, the capital of the state Bahia in Brazil's northeast. The reason for my visit was a law that the Brazilian parliament passed in 2008, which made teaching philosophy obligatory in every Brazilian high school. The rationale offered for this law was that philosophy is necessary for good citizenship. So I went to a range of high schools in Salvador to see for myself how this law is playing out in the classroom. Salvador was also Brazil's first colonial capital, and the city center is dominated by 4 impressive Baroque churches. Along the cloister arcades of one of them, the Igreja de São Francisco, moral allegories in blue and white tiles from Portugal exhort visitors to shun vice, seek virtue, and be mindful of the shortness of life. And one of these panels, showing a group of arguing bearded men in long tunics, was titled Philosophia Vitae Magistra. So tell me, Professor, how should we live? My wife, who is a very down-to-earth physician, asked me as we were looking at this panel. The question was meant to poke fun at me, but also more generally at philosophy's pretension to be able to offer this kind of guidance. At the time, I was just completing a scholarly volume on philosophers from antiquity to the 17th century who would all have agreed with Cicero's claim. Philosophy can indeed uncover the universe's meaning, it can guide us to living well, and teach us how to build good societies. And in times of affliction, it can offer us consolation. So I had a very personal stake in this question. Did I devote years of intellectual labor to clarifying a project that can no longer be defended? In the Brazilian context, the question what benefit citizens can expect from studying philosophy was, of course, particularly pressing, but ultimately it is a pressing question for anyone concerned about the purpose of studying and teaching philosophy. I think, and maybe this is the morosity of middle age speaking here, I think that philosophy can no longer make good on the promise to guide or console in Cicero's sense. Philosophy, thus conceived, is, I think, inextricably tied up with an indefensible metaphysics, a concept of a divine mind that orders the universe into which we humans can connect if we perfect our mind, the divine spark in us. Since this divine mind is the best thing there is, becoming like it constitutes the good life. Leading as many people as possible to do the same in turn constitutes good politics. And since this good is immutable and eternal, attaining it allows us to rationally manage, or, if we follow the Stoics, even extirpate the passions, the desires and fears generated by the unstable things that we normally want: wealth, power, fame, health, beauty, family, friends, and the like. Note that Cicero himself, in part, turned to philosophy for help to deal with his grief over losing things of exactly this sort: the unraveling of his political career and the death of his beloved daughter Tullia. Cicero's sorrow was such that he divorced his second wife, Publilia, because she didn't shed enough tears over his loss. Now, according to the Stoic philosophy Cicero lays out in the Tusculan Disputations, the only thing of true value is virtue. We achieve virtue by perfecting our mind, which means aligning it with the divine mind, ordering the universe. While the divine mind arranges all things in the best possible way, the best state of the whole sometimes requires doing things pretty upsetting to some of its parts. But once we realize that the things whose loss we mourn are not really good, in Cicero's case, political power and enjoying the company of his daughter, we can no longer blame the divine mind for sacrificing them for the good of the whole. The true sage, in fact, leaves behind the petty view of regular humans to contemplate things through the eyes of the divine mind. From there, he or she can embrace life's blows just as much as life's blessings. Everything is part of the divine mind's perfect plan. Now, I propose calling this kind of philosophy the religion of reason. It is perhaps most clearly articulated or worked out by the Stoics, but I think that the intersection of human and divine rationality that I take to be its moral metaphysical core can also be found in Plato and Aristotle, as well as in the students of these Greek philosophers in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. We likewise find versions of the religion of reason in the early modern period. Spinoza, for example, who is deeply engaged with ancient and medieval philosophy, describes the state attained by the true sage as salus, right? Salvation. And in the Enlightenment as well. Even as acerbic a critic of revealed religion as Thomas Paine remains committed to what he calls the true theology of reason. So from the point of view of this religion of reason, the Enlightenment doesn't actually mark a significant break. The true disenchantment, I think, comes after Hegel. When you read authors from Nietzsche to Albert Camus, or for that matter, authors associated with the Wiener Kreis, it is clear that we are no longer moving in a universe governed by a divine mind. So my key question is this. If we agree that we cannot bring back the divine mind, what does this mean for philosophy in general and for its potential role in education in particular? What happens when we move from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations to Camus' myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus represents the effort of human beings to find meaning in a meaningless world, what Camus describes as futility and hopeless labor? Let me know that not everyone agrees that philosophy can no longer claim to be the magistra vitae. There are charlatans like Alain de Botton who have turned philosophy's ancient mystique into lucrative business, but there are also serious scholars from Pierre Hadot to John Cooper who argue that philosophy as a way of life remains a life option. According to Cooper, for example, ancient philosophy can guide us if we are willing to follow, I quote, what reason itself tells us about how we should live, unquote. It would be wonderful, even subversive, if this were true. Just imagine how easy it would be to end violent conflict, poverty, the destruction of nature, and so on, if we could argue compellingly that the scarce goods we usually fight about, things like wealth, power, and so on, are not true goods or are only good as means to something better, while the true good isn't scarce at all. It consists in perfecting our mind by grasping the eternal truth of physics and metaphysics, which of course can be shared by everyone without ever becoming less. Meanwhile, the best political order is one in which we help each other to attain this true good. Wouldn't it be nice if we could make a case for that? To me, however, this seems like a lost cause. And I sometimes find philosophy silence troubling. When students come to talk to me during office hours about the existential questions or life plans, or when a friend of my wife recently suggested I talk to her husband who contracted cancer, can't philosophy help us deal with sickness and death, she asked me. I think it would have been strange had I referred her husband to Plato's Phaedo, right, where Socrates describes philosophy as a preparation for death. Or when I attended the shiva of a family grieving the loss of their 3-year-old son, a classmate of my daughter's in daycare, who had died in a car accident, what kind of consolation would they have found in the Tusculan Disputations? Then there is a broader question of the value of knowledge. Why should we study epistemology and metaphysics, care about true knowledge and things that really are, if the connection between the human mind and the human good, mediated through the divine mind, has been severed? Or consider the natural sciences. For the medieval Jewish Aristotelian Maimonides, natural science meant studying God's wisdom in nature, motivated by the intellectual love of God. From the structure of an animal organism to the movement of the celestial spheres, natural science was about perfecting one's mind by grasping the imprint of divine rationality in nature. This is certainly not the reason a biologist or a physicist today has to get out of bed. And I mentioned to some of you yesterday evening at dinner that we took our daughter when she turned 7 and her class to the planetarium in Montreal. And going to the planetarium today in many ways can be a rather depressing experience, and I think a radically different experience from the one that Aristotle would have had he taken his daughter to the planetarium in ancient Athens, or Maimonides for that matter, had he taken his daughter to the planetarium in 12th century Cordoba. On the broadest level, this is a question that concerns all of us academics who work on extending knowledge and transmitting it through teaching. Why do we do what we do? Obviously, many bodies of knowledge have instrumental value, right? Improve our health, safety, comfort, mobility, and so on. But I find it difficult to argue that they also have intrinsic value without holding on to some version of the moral metaphysical framework I've described before. So this is a shift I'm interested in exploring when philosophy, or the project of reason, lost its religious dimension, its ability to guide and console, and the implications of this loss. The interior of this Baroque church in Salvador I mentioned at the start was entirely covered in gold foils for a dazzling celebration of the triumph of faith. I felt a certain relief when I got out of there. But what are we left with if joining the conversation of the bearded man on the panel in the cloister arcades no longer provides a viable alternative to what the church has to offer? Thank you. And sorry for going over time a little bit.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Anthony Grafton, is Harry Putnam Professor in the Department of History at Princeton University, also a valued mentor of myself and others in this room. He has written numerous books about liberal education in Europe from the 15th through 17th centuries. He also regularly engages in broader public debates in forums such as the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, on the status of the humanities, the problems facing new career scholars, and the importance of scholarly collaboration. So, Tony?
Thank you, Ada, and thank you to Aaron and Aviva for organizing this, and to Aviva for her very moving remarks, and for allowing me to be the bearded man in this conversation. In 1713 and 1715, Johann Burkhard Menke gave 2 lectures in Latin on the charlatanry of the learned. Menke knew a lot about this ever-enticing subject. He was born into the academic aristocracy. His father, Otto, a wealthy professor, think about that, a wealthy professor at the University of Leipzig, was a dazzling lecturer. His colleagues complained to their lord, August the Physically Strong of Saxony, that Otto had taken all of their students away. More important still, in 1682, Otto founded the Acta Eruditorum, one of the greatest of the early scientific and philological periodicals. No one is a hero to his or her editor. Otto Menke, whose contributors included Boyle, Wallace, Leibniz, and Bernoulli, knew the foibles of the learned as well as any New Yorker fact-checker knows the foibles of the few remaining long-form journalists. Otto nonetheless struggled to maintain standards of civility when conflicts erupted, as they often did, and usually succeeded. Johann Burckhardt, born into this and born to succeed as editor of the Acta, traveled in Western Europe, studied history and law at Halle, and became an original historian and biographer. He not only served as editor of the Acta, he was 6 times Rector Magnificus of the University of Leipzig, a Hofrat, a court historian, a fellow of the Royal Society, and a member of the Berlin Academy. So he was an insider, but in his lectures, the insider posed as an outsider. He put on the frontispiece a street theater, actors and jugglers capering under the banner Muntus fult decipi, the world wishes to be deceived, Latin pronounced in Saxon, and he brought every variety of learned imbecile on stage, each more risible than the last. There were the members of academies who called themselves the seraphs, the sleepy and the incapable, the professors who included who assumed absurdly inflated titles. Many demand to be called clarissimus, who were unknown outside their city, magnificus, who have no dignity, consultissimus, who have no advice to give, the pan-sophists, whose books entitled Golden Keys, Royal Methods, and Oceanic Micro-Macro-Cosmicos claim to offer the keys to life, the universe, and everything. Always and everywhere he pilloried the vain, and particularly vain academic administrators. Johann Seger, for example, who had an engraving made on copper showing the crucified Christ in the background and himself in the foreground. From his lips came the words, "Lord Jesus, do you love me?" And from the lips of Jesus, "Yes, most eminent, excellent, and worthy rector of Wittenberg, I love you." No wonder that the book went through many editions and was followed by many others on the misogyny of scholars, the misocosmia, unkemptness of scholars, and on scholars without manners, or on literary Machiavellism. Now, this satire and the genre it helped to create are usually cited as dispositive evidence, dispositive negative evidence about the universities of the Holy Roman Empire. And no wonder, as Chad Wellman shows in a recent and excellent book, Organizing Enlightenment, in many ways these universities were going down the chute faster than we are. Old ones were closing at Danzig and elsewhere. Attendance, the source of income then as now, was plummeting. At one point there were 300 students in all the universities of the Holy Roman Empire together. Those who remained were more interested in parading through cities drunkenly than studying. Even the publishers turned their backs on scholarship as Latin made way for German. The number of German books plummeted after dominating the German world. A few stars glittered at Halle and Göttingen, but the rest of the German academic world was a Stygian darkness that made these few glittering points all the brighter. Menke's satire seems not only to show this decline in course, but to give some of the reasons for it and for the revolution that would have to replace it with the Humboldtian University of the 19th century. And yet, as a wonderful student in my seminar on humanist knowledge making this spring, Paul Babinski pointed out, you can read the text in a completely different way, a very hopeful way as well. Stand aside a little, as Menke took the trouble to do, and note what he was doing. A consummate insider, a great success in the university's own terms, he used one of the central rituals of the university, public oratory, to raise serious questions about its practices and their value. Since he'd read his Thorstein Veblen, well, at least his Castiglione, he realized, as so many observers of universities don't, how deep an effect social mores have on intellectual training, and how powerfully they can exclude those who belong in the conversation. He also had much more to say about many subjects. In this moment, as the great age of the international lawyers, Grotius, Selden, Pufendorf, is coming to an end, Menke already argued that law needed to be refounded on a basis of history that would differentiate the laws of every community. At the beginning of the great age of antiquarianism of the 18th century, Menke savaged Athanasius Kircher, whom some mischievous boys in Rome had carved up a stone and given it to him, and Kircher jumped for joy and interpreted these as hieroglyphs, and argued that real antiquarianism would take a much more object-oriented approach and a lot less speculation about meanings. Admittedly a cruel joke, but then as Robert Darnton taught us, cruel jokes were beloved in the 18th century, especially when they were subversive. So what's wonderful in this text is its prophetic character. In many ways, Menke was really looking forward to those reforms that would come into being in the late 18th and early 19th century, discipline by discipline. Even the genre he picked is highly significant, for as Wellman points out, the lecture, much derided in recent times, was actually the preeminent vehicle, far more than the seminar, of the transformation of German intellectual life. The charismatic, newly conceived lecture of Herder, Schelling, Friedrich August Wolff. Goethe hid behind a curtain to hear Friedrich August Wolff explicate Homer. Barthold Georg Niebuhr on Roman history. It was the lecture that rallied communities, dramatized the new approaches to learning. Now, I think this little story matters a lot. Matters partly because we all live on thin ice in research universities these days. We humanists, of course, feel particularly battered and derided, but then we always do. The natural scientists don't feel any better, and indeed it takes longer and you have worse chances of becoming a professor in the natural sciences than you do in the humanities to this day. Outside and inside the universities, a few years ago, experts were belaboring us with paeans to the oceanic macro-microcosmico of the 21st century, the MOOC, which, however, has so quickly metamorphosized from angelic chariots to Hindenburgs. They were denouncing the sage on the stage, who was somehow going to be much better when replaced as the vox in the box. What worries me even more is that universities accept so much of this critique. The main force we have to encourage faculty engagement in most universities that I know is funds that call for innovation, for new courses, novelties in pedagogy, radical change. Now, change is good. Change is vital. It's the only way we can bring new subjects into the curriculum, as Menke and Wolff did. It's the only way we can deal with new kinds of student. But I think the past, as Menke's past, can offer treasures of pedagogy and method that we are too likely to forget. As here, I'm not sure how many of those here thought when coming in that we were replicating an 18th century ritual of taking a sabbatical moment to reconsider the purposes of the university. It seems to me that what we need, among the other many needs of the liberal arts and all the liberal arts, is a real history of universities. My teacher, Arnaldo Momigliano, always used to say that you studied the history of scholarship not just to understand its past, but to enlarge scholarship now, which was perpetually narrowing and becoming more technical without regard to its own past. And I think the same is true of the history of education. We need a special kind of history of education. It has to be written by people who are willing to go into past classrooms, recreate the rituals and practices of education, plow through endless pages of dead student notes and even worse, dead professors' notes in order to find the gems, those moments Eva mentioned when light bulbs went on. Writers the cost is high, but I think the rewards can really be great. Over and over again, it turns out, when you look at the past of the humanities, or sorry, the past of the liberal arts, that it's the beginning of next week. And I'll finish with a tiny example. Last week at a conference in Princeton, a former student explained what she did when hired as a liberal arts college at Lahore to teach students who were constantly subject to political repression, attacks on their free speech, and often enough to violence. She turned back to what she had learned at Princeton 10 years before in our intensive Western civilization course and in our program in European cultural studies, and mounted a course on the Iliad. Not the consoling Iliad we had taught so much as the Iliad of Simon Weil and Jonathan Shea, and she found that it brought her students not consolation, but recognition, help to understand, help to describe the world they actually lived in. Personal history and pedagogical history turned out to be the most contemporary thing you could imagine. Change has much to offer, innovation is wonderful, but history has resources of its own for the liberal arts. We should find them and use them.
Thank you very much, Tony. Beautiful. Lorraine Daston is a director of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, a visiting professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and a permanent fellow of the... Thank you. She is currently studying the emergence of big science and big humanities in the 19th century, and has previously published on a wide range of topics in the history of science, including the history of probability and statistics, the emergence of the scientific fact, and the history of scientific objectivity.
Thank you very much, Ada, and thank you very much, Aviva and Aaron, for bringing us together to reflect on why we do what we do and how we could do it better. I am a historian of science, and that means that I have been called upon, like many of my tribe, to mediate when the dialogue between the humanities and the sciences has once again broken down. We are the marriage counselors of the Republic of Letters, where the divorce rate is higher than in the population at large. And that will be my function in my scant 10 minutes today. I have 3 points to make, the first of which will be historical. I simply want to make the point that some sciences and much of mathematics have been essential elements of a liberal education since the invention of the liberal arts. My second point will be short, but I hope also self-evident, namely that liberal education still needs a scientific and mathematical component, now more than ever, in the science and technology-saturated society in which we live, in order to prepare free citizens to think, debate, and act in a democratic society. And the third point, which is perhaps more counterintuitive, is that the sciences need liberal education more than ever now. Not only its generalist outlook and its dedication to teaching with no presuppositions, but also as a form of what Kant would have called orientation. So I know the clock is ticking, and I have many centuries to get through. The term liberal education derives from the 7 medieval artes liberales, and I'll just read them so that you can hear for yourself how prominent the sciences and mathematics were. The trivium, the rhetoric, the grammar, the logic, supplemented by the quadrivium, astronomy, music theory. Music theory is a part of mathematics until the 18th century, geometry, and arithmetic. This is the knowledge necessary to a free man, by which was usually meant an adult, property-owning male, who exercised the rights of a citizen in the polity and those of a paterfamilias in the household, and they were opposed to the mechanical arts, which were the skills needed to make a living. When the term liberal education came into wide usage in English in the late 18th and 19th century, these associations were preserved despite the innovations of the Renaissance humanists, who introduced a great deal more Greek as well as Latin, classics, lots of Horace, Plutarch, Livy, and Tacitus, but they also introduced mathematics. And since Jesuits were in charge of elite education throughout Europe, and the Jesuits were extremely keen on the mathematical sciences, that guaranteed that the elite of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, David Hume, and others all received fine mathematical educations. But the liberal in liberal education still meant free, and that free meant not a slave to monetary considerations. And that's why in 1833, when William Whewell, physicist, mathematician, master of Trinity College, proposed to his colleagues at one of the early meetings of the British Association for the Advancement of Science that they call themselves, on the analogy of artists, scientists, even his best friends indignantly rejected the name. Why? Because it suggested a certain kind of narrow, technical, utilitarian specialization. They preferred the old-fashioned term, natural philosopher, which licensed its bearer to roam through all of the science and also philosophy, and indeed theology and literature at will. Ideally, their science would serve practical purposes, but practical purposes of the public good. Their science was neither specialized nor was it commercial, so much so that aside from a few university chairs in the sciences and mathematics, it was almost impossible to make a living out of the subject. All of this changes in the latter part of the 19th century when the natural sciences, for the first time, cashed out Francis Bacon's IOU, issued in 1620, that knowledge was power over nature, in the creation of the first science-based industries, for example, those which extracted textile dyes from coal tar derivatives. Never before had the color mauve been seen so often. Globe-spanning telegraph networks, and the infinitely varied uses of electricity. It's at this point that there are campaigns throughout Europe and in the United States to introduce not only the sciences, but also modern languages into the curriculum. In the American context, it's the rise of the social sciences in the 1920s and the 1930s that created not only the still reigning models of liberal education, but also the current divisions of the great continents of knowledge, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. This was in the context of debates over Darwinism, and in this context, both the natural and the social sciences hoisted the banner of freedom of inquiry unimpeded by religious dogmatism. So at this university, at the University of Chicago, they banded together to mount liberal education courses called Man in Society and the Nature of the World and Man, which concluded with a survey of contemporary problems facing humanities. It's at this point that a rather motley crew of literary scholars, philosophers, and historians, people who did not normally see one another as allies, alarmed to see their monopoly on ethical instruction threatened by both the social and natural sciences, banded together in what they called the New Humanities movement of the first decades of the 20th century, where they claimed they were the heirs to the Renaissance humanist who had fought the tyranny of the church. The modern humanists, this is a new designation which they had coined, fought the naturalism of the sciences, both the natural and the social. Only the newly christened humanities disciplines, they argued, could provide spiritual insight into the human condition and prepare free citizens for a free nation. So what does this gallop through history of the place of the sciences and mathematics in liberal education teach us, besides the obvious point that classifications of knowledge change? First, it teaches us that the meaning of freedom, the liberty that a liberal education strives for, has been substantially shaped by the modern sciences. Freedom of inquiry and freedom of instruction, especially in the context of the secularization of the classroom, were principles that were driven by the sciences. And second, the increasing specialization and technicality of scientific knowledge that Tony mentioned has made it difficult to reconcile with the generalist vision that animates contemporary liberal education. And this is not just the predicament of the natural sciences. The same goes mutatis mutandis for disciplines like philology and sociology. So for this reason, it's not surprising that liberal education is so unthinkingly conflated with the humanities and the humanities alone. Science and liberal education seem to have become estranged. It's certainly true that scientists favor teaching research students over teaching beginning undergraduates. This is a tendency which is strongly reinforced by the economics of both the laboratory and field research, which require lots of technically competent and dedicated but cheap labor. Should liberal education and the sciences go their separate ways? I think from the side of liberal education, the answer is mixed. On the one hand, it seems to falsify the nature of the modern sciences to force it into the generalist, human-centered mold of what has come to constitute liberal education. But, and I think this is decisive, one need only murmur the words climate change to understand why it's more urgent than ever that free citizens of a free polity be educated to grasp scientific issues in modes of reasoning. I'd like to now turn, though, to the more counterintuitive and final part of what I'd like to argue, namely, the sciences need liberal education. Unlike the genteelly impoverished humanities, the science departments aren't dependent on undergraduate enrollments to finance faculty research, at least some of them aren't. The enormous rise in government and corporate funding has freed them from these constraints, but it has enslaved them in other respects. From the side of the scientists, I think there are at least 3 good reasons why they should participate in liberal education. First, that government and corporate spending I just mentioned come with strings attached, and I don't just mean a lot of bureaucratic red tape. It's not simply encumbered research, it's diverted some of the energies of research to topics which have political incentives but have very little prospect of yielding, at least in the near term, scientific fruits. These constraints have also denatured the rhythms and internal ethos of research. There's the relentless 3 to 5 year tempo of grant proposals, the pressure to choose safe bets rather than more venturesome topics of investigation, and the mentality of public accountability that has led to ever greater reliance on quantitative, mechanical indicators of quality, such as citation indices. There are no more vitriolic enemies of Hirsch factors than the scientists who are subject to them. Second, science needs liberal education for recruitment purposes. And here, with Tony's permission, I will tell simply an anecdote to make my point. I had the great good fortune of hearing Tony give a talk, a kind of apologia pro vita sua, to a group of German scholars and scientists. It was a very distinguished group, and there were, I think, at least 9 or 10 Nobel laureates in the sciences in the audience. At the end of this captivating talk, one of the scientists asked, "And tell us, Professor Grafton, how are your students these days?" And Tony became Tony at his most beatific. He said, my students are wonderful. They have never been so wonderful. They are incandescently wonderful. Every year they improve." I sat with those scientists over dinner, and they were a very melancholy lot. They said, our students are not improving. We are getting fewer and fewer of them. What does he know that we don't? And I'm afraid that every statistical survey bears out their melancholy. The Norwegians have a project on science education in which they asked high school students in about 25 different countries all over the globe whether they wanted more math or science in their curriculum. The country that wanted least was Norway. The country that wanted most was Uganda. And the United States is somewhere closer to Norway, as are all Western industrialized countries. Despite all the drum beating for the STEM disciplines, the best and the brightest no longer want to study the sciences. Why is this the case? Perhaps if science courses taught in the liberal education curriculum might portray science as a way of life, not just a body of knowledge to be mastered, not just as a means to practical ends. It might once again become attractive to talented students who might otherwise have never felt them and pulled in that direction. And I'll make just one final point because I know my time is up. The necessity of explaining the why as well as the how and the what of a discipline's pursuit of knowledge is as essential for the sciences as it is in other fields. It used to be the case that a master of the field, a James Clerk Maxwell in physics, a David Hilbert in mathematics, would survey the entire discipline from an Olympian vantage point and define what research topics should engage the best minds for the next 3 decades. No one can do that anymore. Scientists themselves complain of the splintering tendencies of their discipline. In order to answer the so what question, which forms the core of all liberal education, scientists themselves would have to take time to reflect and gain orientation, which so many of them, including their students, who often end up knocking at the back door of the history of science, so desperately seek. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful celebration of the same issue that the young Joe Walton was facing, having to choose between literature and science at the age of 14. Our final speaker, Haun Saussy, is university professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and in the Committee on Social Thought here at the University of Chicago. He is a leading scholar of Chinese and comparative literature, whose range of academic interests includes Chinese poetry, literature, aesthetics, and culture, as well as theories of oral poetry, the history of interpretation, and problems in translation. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the faculty advisory boards for 2 new initiatives at the University of Chicago, the Neubauer Family Collegium for Culture and Society and the Stefanovich Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, as well as of the Posen Family Center for Human Rights. And he has a new book, The Ethnography of Rhythm.
Thank you. Well, my talk is called Liberal Education as Radical Proposition in the Late Ming. Just at the moment when the liberal arts are under attack in America as being a costly and ornamental excrescence, Chinese university administrators are trying to reform their curricula in order to include more general education and more seminar-style teaching, something that Martin Nussbaum mentioned last night and that Brian Garston, present in this room, and I have a little bit of experience in. Cao Li, a professor and dean at Tsinghua University, finds this risky. Many universities, she says, long quotation coming, are rushing to join in the adventure of internationalizing higher education with foreign capital. All these shifts and transformations pose severe challenges to the Chinese university, one of which is the problem of how the identity of a Chinese university can be defined and upheld. In this regard, liberal education cannot ignore the strategic importance of maintaining national identity and cultural self-consciousness. The model of the American university is being invoked to rationalize and standardize university education. We will have to realize that one of the most disturbing results of globalization is the standardization and homogenization of cultures, which threatens to deconstruct nationality and dismantle national consciousness as well as cultural confidence. To break out of such a globalizing paradigm, both culturally and intellectually, is a challenge to all nations and their educational enterprises. That was Cao Li in a long quotation. But as Cao offhandedly recognizes, the Chinese university is itself something of a foreign implant, having been developed out of the traditional imperial academies in the late 19th century on a largely German and then American model, later revised under Soviet influence to be more tightly articulated with national economic planning, and since the late 1970s, subject to a variety of sometimes contradictory directives. The Chinese university does not have, in other words, much of a subjectivity, or 主观性, to use the Chinese cant word employed by Cao, to refer back to. No consistent survival of an academically based cultural essence. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If no one can deny that liberal education in its present form is an American intellectual export, deriving ultimately from the Yale College Report of 1828, an application on Chinese soil of American models at least there is no antithetical model of the truly Chinese university that might be invoked to resist it. Or is there? In thinking about China, it's never a good idea to be too present-minded. The Chinese Empire, which has the advantage over all others in terms of longevity, is gone but certainly not forgotten. And for about 2,000 years, that empire recruited its administrators through a network of educational institutions concentrating on mastery of a specific set of texts. For much of that period, the portal of recruitment was a series of examinations held locally and nationally at regular intervals, testing the faculties of the mind through timed essay questions. These essays were read anonymously and graded by panels of experts. Extra points were awarded for membership in previously disfavored groups. The subjects to be covered in the exams, as well as the priorities and stances of the graders, were regularly rejiggered. The question of what liberal education would mean in a long-term Chinese context is somewhat modeled by the fact that the texts with which candidates in this traditional system were expected to be familiar are broadly humanistic, that is, historical, philosophical, and literary works of antiquity. To see the problem of liberal education from the point of view of a Ming Dynasty dissident intellectual, for example, we have to put aside the content of that educational system and concentrate on its form and goal, namely, preparation for the most rewarding career possible, that of administrator in one or another department of the vast imperial bureaucracy. The Chinese state was, of course, the largest employer in the country. Moreover, it held the monopoly, or very nearly so, on prestigious careers for young men. Under such conditions, it is no surprise that education was not always seen as an end in itself. Pure learning might have actually benefited from having a less heavy chain of rewards attached to its restless and nimble feet. In the Ming Dynasty, the rewards began to come off the feet. Prosperity, resulting from a growing global economy, gave more young men the opportunity to study and compete in the examinations, while at the same time, political factors led to a shrinking of the numbers of candidates rewarded with actual posts and careers. There were a great many unemployed, disaffected intellectuals with all the titles but no prospects. One candidate who studied hard, received top marks, and did get one of the most prestigious jobs in his year, might have remained a mere unexceptional name in a long list of names had he not done something counter to type. Li Zhi, whose dates are 1527 to 1602, and whose selected writings you can now read in English, was that extraordinarily successful young man who later turned his back on the whole system that had made him a success. In an autobiography written in the third person, Li Zhi tells us that as a student he, I quote, found himself confused and unsettled. He studied the commentaries and annotations but did not critically examine himself. He blamed himself and wished to give up studying altogether. But with a great deal of time on his hands and nothing for him to do to pass the days, he sighed and said, "All this is nothing but play acting. My studies are no more than plagiarism and superficial reading. Not even the examiners understand each and every detail of Confucius's teachings." And so he sought out the most popular and widely read examination essays of his time and recited several of these each day. By the time of his examinations, he had memorized nearly 500 essays. When the examination topic was given, he merely copied, transcribed, and recorded what he had memorized. He received high middle honors. End of quotation. Unlike many, Li Zhi went on to a series of good jobs. But after more of a decade of relatively high positions in the Imperial Academy and the Ministry of Justice, Li resigned his commissions and went to live with a family of educated provincials, purportedly as tutor to their sons, but mainly as in-house philosopher. After quarreling with the elders of that family, he moved into a Buddhist monastery as a lay brother, a shocking thing for a former official to do. From this marginal position, he wrote sarcastically about the sort of person he had been, contrasting present-day career-minded Confucians with the sage himself and his one understanding disciple. I'll quote Li Zhi now. In one of these polemics, he says, "When Confucius ate coarse rice and Yan Hui lived in a humble alleyway, Were they not one in spirit with the legendary culture hero Yao? After Yanhui passed away, Confucius's subtle words were cut short. Sagely learning died out, and genuine Confucianism was no longer transmitted. This is why Confucius said, "Heaven is destroying me." Why so? Because even though all his remaining disciples were learned, they didn't regard hearing the way as the heart of their concern. So what was left to prevent them from being led astray by the wealth and status they gained by serving powerful nobles? Thus today, those who have no talent, no learning, no accomplishments, and no insight, yet wish to achieve great wealth and status, have absolutely no choice but to profess the Confucian way. And those who truly wish to discuss the study of the way, to grasp the point of the Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist transcendence of the world and avoid the suffering of wealth and status, have absolutely no choice but to shave their heads and live as monks. That's Li Zhi writing in the 1580s. That is, the apparent triumph of Confucianism has destroyed its inner meaning by linking it to wealth and status. Only those who dare to drop to a far lower rung on the social ladder and become Buddhist monks have any chance of pursuing learning for its own sake, of accomplishing the ends of liberal education more cynico. This is one form of Ming Dynasty protest against educational careerism. Another takes the frustration of most educated men of the time and rotates it around the axis of gender. With the increase in wealth and ease, particularly in the southeastern provinces of China, more and more women began to gain access to the kind of education that their fathers, brothers, and sons had enjoyed. But no woman could sit for the examinations. Theirs was, perforce, learning for its own sake. Li Zhi imagines a scene in which such a woman occupies the examiner's seat, invoking, with his usual irony, Confucius as his witness against all latter-day Confucianism. Quote, "Suppose there exists a person with a woman's body and a man's vision. Suppose she delights in hearing upright discourse and knows that uncultivated speech is not worth listening to. She delights in learning about the transcendent and understands that the ephemeral world is not worth becoming attached to. If men of today were to meet with such a woman, I fear that they would all feel shame and remorse, sweat profusely, and be unable to utter a single syllable. It may have been in hopes of encountering such a woman that the sage Confucius wandered the world, desiring to meet her just once but unable to find her. And for such a person to be dismissed as a mere woman, a short-sighted creature, isn't this unjust?" End of quotation. I would not wish any of you to follow the fate of Li Zhi. He committed suicide in a jail cell while being taken to Beijing for questioning, his provocations having finally provoked the wrong people. But his analysis, even down to its sarcasm, and his personal history do fit, I think, the typical relationship between career education and liberal education through most of world history. Learning for its own sake and asking open-ended questions are generally a thinly rewarded way of life, often a violently dissuaded one. An instrumentalization of study as an enhancement of fungible human resources has always been the norm. We are fortunate to have lived in a bubble or parenthesis of time when the choices have not been so stark. This moment requires militancy from the mild-mannered army of the liberally educated, a group of habitual non-joiners who can nonetheless, I hope, recognize a common threat. May the right-hand parenthesis never close on the favorable period for the liberal arts that we have been lucky enough to experience. Let us not only push back at the attempt to close it, but strive to hold the parenthesis open for more and more people to follow. Several speakers have already pointed to the strategic points in the American polity where we might exert pressure. I, for one, would be delighted if the international educational marketplace were to spawn, by a massive perverse effect, thousands of new Li Zhis and a China ready to listen to them. Thank you.
Excellent. We now have about half an hour for discussion, and I wanted to start by inviting the speakers to respond to each other directly before opening up for general questions. Does any of you have something you want to follow up on that one of your colleagues has said?
I have just a historical note for Carlos. It seems to me that perhaps the Brazilian idea of introducing philosophy in all high schools is historically related to the French lycée, where the last year was always, the year of philosophie. And this was, in fact, a democratizing initiative that dates back from the very beginning of the 19th century. So there really is a historical root there worth exploring.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely may be a French connection because actually academic philosophy in Brazil is in some sense a colonial enterprise that was started in the 1930s in São Paulo by the French. So French professors of philosophy in some sense introduced serious philosophy, or Brazilians now call serious philosophy, into the curriculum. And interestingly enough, it's actually a certain tension between this tradition of academic philosophy and this kind of publicly minded philosophy that the law tries to promote, because serious philosophy in Brazil is mostly history of philosophy, which doesn't lend itself, if it's done in this kind of erudite manner, doesn't seem to lend itself to the kind of, democratic discussion that the law wants to foster. And so what I saw on the ground looked a little less, let's say, good, looked a little more confusing, a little less good than what it is on paper. So but it's quite possible. I should maybe add that the Brazilians, outdid the French. So in Brazil, you have 3 years of philosophy. So it's somehow. But it's the curriculum was definitely still in flux, and there was this tension between the public project and this legacy of French history of philosophy that didn't seem to lend itself to it.
But behind the French Republican initiative lurks an older one, because the Jesuit secondary school ended with theology, and the French lycée clearly secularized that into philosophy. As an undergraduate at this university, I had the great pleasure, as one of the Jews from the East, of confronting the Catholics from the Midwest, many of them products of Quigley North and Quigley South seminary high schools in Chicago, which still had a final year of theology. Many was the night spent arguing about Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God.
A question for Tony. Did I hear a plaidoyer to revive the lecture as a form of liberal education teaching? Most of us associate, I think, liberal education teaching these days with the intensive seminar that Aviva conjured so vividly for us at the outset. If that's the case, I'd like to hear a bit more.
Well, I think the seminar is absolutely necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient. The lecture provides other kinds of things. It's not a sensible way to present a lot of facts in the age of Wikipedia, obviously, but it is a way to model an effort to give a comprehensive interpretation of anything from a literary text to a historical period to a scientific argument, and to model it in a dramatic and powerful way. When I talk to former undergraduates, many of whom I've taught in multiple seminars and have seen others teach in multiple seminars, I'm struck again and again that the Pauline moment that made them decide to devote themselves to scholarship came in a lecture rather than in a seminar. It was watching someone else model inquiry that made them think, yes, that's how I have to spend my life.
I've certainly had parallel experiences, even here at UChicago, starting to teach in the core, of getting feedback at the end of the quarter of students saying, I wish she had lectured more, the discussions were good, but she had such great things to say, I wanted a higher ratio of lecture to discussion, which is the opposite of what we think of as the wonderful luxury of small courses, but the students do hunger for that. During your paper, Juan, I kept thinking of an issue that I would like to ask Tony to comment on, its parallels with our period of Renaissance humanism, which is, of course, that there's discussion, I'm thinking of the work of Bob Black, about whether the fact that being a humanist was also a very profitable career path is somehow incompatible with the idea of it having been a philosophically sincere one, and whether whenever there is money and this is profitable, that is incompatible with it also being deep as an active philosophy, which I think is something that we debate a lot. Tony, would you?
We do debate this a lot, and Bob, who is a magnificent researcher, has scrutinized hundreds of documents from Renaissance classrooms in vain to find evidence of actual moral teaching in the explicit content of the classroom. And this despite the fact that the first speech in any course always said, this is the moral and prudential profit that you'll get from the course. Now this leaves us with puzzles. We don't actually have the classroom. We have these relics from it. We don't know if perhaps people don't need to take down the Pauline moment of conversion because you don't forget the Pauline, but you might forget the pluperfect subjunctive. So we don't know for certain. But my own feeling is that I think in reality, in the institution, we're always trying to square Haun Saussy's circle. Or your character circle. We're always trying to teach people to think, to imagine that the world might be different than it was, but we're also trying to give them skills which have practical value, because that is most of what one does as a university teacher of undergraduates. Most of the people we teach are going out into the world to work in a vast variety of careers. My former students include a Ringling Brothers clown, many advertising people, and lots of doctors and lawyers. And I think that many of them have said to me that they value immensely what they learned, and they still use it. So I think we always are desperately trying to square this circle. Of course, we are always delighted in our vain little souls when someone knocks on the office door and says, "Can I be a scholar?" But I don't think that's the main or most desirable or only product of what we want to do.
I would agree. The famous Yale 1828 report says that the purpose of enlarging and strengthening the faculties of the mind is so that when people go into their professions, which is expected they will at a later date, they will be able to engage with the materials of that profession in a not narrow-minded sort of way. And so, you will be a better banker, lawyer, whatever the options were in 19th century Connecticut, for having spent time with Cicero's disputations and with Euclid and so on, because you'll be able to see around the immediate missions that you're assigned. And I think that is something that we can all still find resonance with.
The first humanities graduate student we know of in the United States or in North America was James Madison, who spent a postgraduate year at Princeton studying mostly Hebrew. It ended well, I would say.
Lorraine, did you?
Oh, just a footnote to that, which is the insistence of the leading scientists of the 19th and 20th century that they have a liberal education. I think of Hermann von Helmholtz absolutely insisting, despite the necessity, of course, of introducing science into the German secondary school curriculum, that it could not be at the expense of the classics. And his reason was not that they would become better scientists. He did not in any way believe that was the case. It would be because they would not become just scientists. The great fear was that even science could not become a genuine way of life, a vocation, as Max Weber was to put it not that long afterwards, if it was only science.
You've made me think of friends of mine in chemistry who often talk about how the med school bound students are more unscrupulous and willing to cheat and do destructive and competitive behaviors. And in contrast with the students who are bound to chemistry, who very frequently are not only more genuinely excited by this as a discipline, but also because they have fewer other requirements to be doing to graduate, are taking literature courses and going to Shakespeare seminars and other such hybrid activities. An interesting parallel.
I wanted to press a little bit the point of science as a way of life, also in light of this planetarium experience that I described with my daughter. So at the end of your presentation, you argued quite compellingly for the need of the sciences. They need the liberal arts as much or more than liberal arts need science. And in part because it allows them to develop this sort of more reflective attitude to their practice and not look at it only in terms of instrumental benefits and maybe even choose it as a way of life. But how exactly can one make that attractive if one no longer has this kind of metaphysical framework that Aristotle had, that medieval had, that Spinoza had. For them, there was self-evident that one should choose science in the broadest sense as a way of life, because this is where permanent and true and perhaps even eternal joy lies. But we somehow no longer can make that case. What is the sort of compelling argument for choosing science as a way of life?
Oh, I think that
we all make this choice, right? But
yes, and I take it, Carlos, you're using science here in the capacious German sense of Wissenschaft, so that all of us are Wissenschaftler here, and at the
very broad sense, yeah.
I think that it's a question which is surprisingly rarely posed, because the proof of the pudding is in the living. I don't think that people who voluntarily devote 80 hours a week to what they are doing for the sheer zest of it need a metaphysical framework to justify it. I do think, however, they need an ethical framework, and I'm extremely worried, frankly, about the fact that so few biomedical results can be replicated these days. That is another matter entirely. But I think the real problem about the sciences these days, at least this is purely anecdotal, of those who do come knocking at my institute's door and say, maybe the history of science is the place for me, is, and these are people who have not just done a PhD, they've done the German habilitation as well, they're far into this, is that they say, we have no idea where this is going. We have no idea why we are studying the questions we are studying, and we have no idea of, in terms of the branching path of possible research questions, why we should choose one over the other. They have no sense of a trajectory.
And one thing that the ethic of science demands, which is truly hard, I think this is what Weber was really talking about, is a passionate commitment to the provisional. Because without Carlos's worldview, which is gone, as scholars, everything we do is provisional, and the best things we do are likely to be paved over and buried soonest, because other people will be attracted to them and will come back and will do it better. And that is an ethical commitment which is really hard, and which I don't think we always convey as clearly as we should.
But it has its other side, which is we are part of a transgenerational undertaking. None of us, as Weber says, in 10, in 25, in 50 years, all we have worked for will become surpassed. That can only be a message, not a counsel of despair, but a message for hope. If one imagines the continuity of the enterprise, that, as you say, we will have students knocking at our door saying, can I be a scholar?
But that's why it has to be modeled and in a dramatic way, and that's why it has to be made possible as a human and professional pursuit. Two things which the modern university may not be doing as well as it might.
But if I may play the advocate of the devil a little bit, so where is this progress leading, right? So again, if I imagine Hegel taking his daughter to the Pergamon Museum, right? So everything he sees makes sense to him. Somehow he can tell a coherent story, and he will expect that more research into human cultures will in some sense prove and will substantiate the kind of overall vision that he has. We don't seem to have such a story to tell, so we can add more facts about the broad range of human cultures. We can add build larger natural history museums that will also be richer than what was there in the past, and will include new bodies of knowledge. But it seems that we don't have the sort of overall vision that actually allows us to make sense of those facts, right? So we know the world, both the natural world and the cultural world, better than any group of human beings before us, but it seems to me that it's not so easy to actually make sense of this.
I think we greatly romanticize that there was ever a moment when all of the domains of learning could be added together and to make sense. I think this is the human condition.
I do think related to that the way we tend to micro-specialize and describe ourselves within micro-specialization exaggerates to some extent the degree to which branches of learning seem to be disparate and unrelated to each other. many, many experiences of meeting a colleague at the lunch in the middle of a conference saying, so what do you do? And having them say, oh, nothing that anyone would care about, as the first sentence of the introduction. Should never be the first sentence of your introduction. And students doing that even more, PhD students who aren't even finished yet, already describing their work as inconsequential and isolated, as opposed to as something that would excite a human being, which is proved by the fact that it has excited that student.